We're back with another video today, and we're diving into the Cycling74 Rainbow template that allows us to do web versions of our Rainbow patches. We want to understand the main elements so that we can customize them in our next video. Some of the files that we're going to be looking at today are the Index.html, CSS, and JavaScript files. Today's video is meant for folks that are getting into Rainbow through Max that may not have a lot of web experience. In this series, I'm not going to cover web development in depth, but I'm going to find portions that I find useful for adopting for our Rainbow applications. I've linked some useful resources in the description of this video. Hopefully you're following along with the series, and if you haven't been watching the previous videos, please start there as everything builds up from the beginning. Also, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. So some of the files that come along with the Rainbow template are these three main files here, the index, web.js, style.css. We're going to talk a lot about these two today, some about style, and then these last two, the patch.export.json and rainbow device, are two files that are important to us, but are mainly not going to be changeable for us because one is provided to us from cycling, and this patch.export.json is the main file that gets created when we export from Max and then gets interpreted from these other files to give us this web version of our patch. These files I will show you in a moment are already in our template, and if you've been following along, they're already in our file structure. I'll point out where we can find these in a moment. Mainly the index.html is the file that gives us our structure, or where the elements might sit on a web page. And that's where we will be able to say that we want a text element or button element or slider, and how they look and how they might be presented are going to be controlled through the style.css. The app.js is where we're going to focus a lot, and this is written in JavaScript. It's okay if you don't know JavaScript well. I will talk about what is important or what this template does for us. We are going to be using some portions of it when we make our customized version. Some of it is not going to be relevant, and I just want to go through some of this before we move on to the elements that we want to keep and customize for ourselves. Diving into the VS Code, the web application that we're using to edit most of our code now that we're out of Max, I want to show you where we'll be looking at. So if we go to the Explorer button over here, this gives us the file structure of what we've downloaded and put our exports into from the previous video. If you can recall, we have this folder called export, and that's where we put the files that we created from Max into here. All the other files here are the default files that we got from downloading from the Cycling74 GitHub repo, and this is in our repo now, rainbow-tutorial. And we are going to be looking at the three main files, the index.html, which is part of the root folder. So if I close these, you can see that this is index.html. If we click on this, then VS Code should open up a tab that we can look at. Another one that we're going to be looking at is the app.js, and if we go to the JS folder, then the app.js here, and then that should also open up another tab. And the last one that we're going to look at is the style.css, and if you go to the style folder, then you can see the style.css here. You can see that the index page, index.html, disappeared when I clicked on another file over here. One of the reasons that this does it in VS Code is if you don't make any changes, and you can then the file name will be in italics, and the application by default might assume that you just meant to glance at it and you didn't want to make a change, and so it will close that tab if you didn't make any changes. So we can type in here or make a change. You'll see that there's a white dot that appears to say that, hey, you've made an unsaved change. If I just hit save, then it'll keep this tab here, and I'll open up index.html here. If you hit save too without making any changes, it will assume that you want to make changes now. Okay, so let's quickly look at this HTML page. I'm going to close this side of the application so that we can have more space. I'm going to click on the Explorer button and maybe increase the size just a little bit. Okay. This Index.html is the heart of web development, in that if we don't have code here, then most of the stuff that we typically see on a web page is not visible. And this is all what we describe as tag-based coding. There are elements that we want to have visible or not visible, and most of these things are boilerplate in terms of what type of information we want to show or how we might show it. We're not going to change any of these elements from lines 1 through 10, and for the most part, the things that we see that are visible come from lines 12 and down. Body signifies that all the elements inside this body tag. From here, we want to identify a few things. Most elements are beyond this body tag. We'll see the word div, and we can think about divs as a sort of container for elements. And along with these divs, you'll see that there's an ID equals and then name in quotes. Later on in the code that we'll look at, there's some code that's going to be looking for specifically named elements so that they can run some logic along with them. For example, we can see that inside this rainbow.root is a div with a h1, which is a styling header, describes the way that some text is going to be presented, with a specific ID patcher title. And by default, it has an unnamed patcher as its text. Later on in the code, in the App.JS, I'll point to it later, if we do have a specific name for our patcher, it will find this patcher title by its ID and replace it with the name of the patcher that we have. So if we go back to Safari, you can see that sequencer for Rainbow is the name that we gave it when we exported it from Max. And that information lives in one of the last two files that I mentioned earlier, this export.json. I'll point to you all that in the JavaScript portion of it later. But you'll notice that there's referencing some logic that is happening. And remember, the HTML page itself is mainly providing the structure, and you can think about it as a view, and most of the logic happens in the app.js. So we have many containers that are meant to hold some information. You can see that there's a container by default that is, sorry about this hovering, meant that if you hook up a MIDI keyboard, some elements might be visible. You'll notice that a lot by default, the template has elements that say, oh, you don't have a MIDI input connected. And if you do, then we have logic to say that, oh, we see that it's connected, we'll remove this text and give you more information. By default, in this portion that says Rainbow imports, it says no imports available. If we do have imports, which we do in our own series of imports, the one that we're doing for this series, it will replace or remove this element and have it show the imports that we do have. You can see here imports, and then there's more stuff that changes. And so this default structure is an area that's provided for us, and then the logic changes it based on what our export JSON file has. Many of the things that we see on our page, I'm going to sort of bring this over like this, match up with the structure. So oftentimes, if we don't purposely restyle how things get rearranged, it's possible to do that in logic and also in the CSS. If we don't do a lot of those types of changes, then typically those elements will show up in the order that they appear in the HTML page. Like you can see MIDI keyboard here, and then the next element is imports, then outports, then presets, then parameters. The last part that is really important is at the bottom of this HTML page is references to a couple other JS files, JavaScript files. One is guardrails, which we won't be touching. And the last one is going to be this app.js. And we're going to dive into app.js in a moment. App.js is, like it says, it's the import Rainbow engine wrapper. And that has a lot of logic to it that helps us set up based on what types of, what our export looks like from Max to be pulling in the different sliders or text elements or buttons that we have. And let's just talk about what this script looks like. So when we do our own version of this, we are definitely going to have these two files on here. And this tag right here says it's a script with a type definition of text/JavaScript, letting the page know that this is a JavaScript file. And then src is shorthand for source, or it points to where that file lives in our file structure. And so we can see JS here, JS/app. So JS, the folder of JS, and the file is app.js. So let's look at app.js. And if we look at the very top, this is an asynchronous function called setup. And setup, if we look at this whole function, it is one gigantic function that runs all the way from line 1 down to line 337. And at the very end, 339, is a function call to run this specific function. So everything that's in here is going to be eventually run after it's read the contents. Some of the things that are important is during the setup, this app.js setup function is going to be looking at our patch export JSON. Going back to the original image that I had right here, this is where the export from Max Rainbow has all the vital information. It has the way that we created our sequencer. All those things are in here, and the app.js is the main logic that interprets that, and it wants to know where that file is and stores it in this variable. I'm not going to dive into every element here, but we just want to sort of understand some things. One of the bigger things that we want to understand here are these next few lines. If you've never created or used audio in the web, there's web audio protocols, and what this part does is creates a audio context. And an audio context is, you can think about it as a logic container for all the types of audio that we want to have playing on our web page. You might have multiple audio contexts, but it's more common to have just one simple audio context that gets replaced. And we have some variables that creates a namespace for this audio context. Then the next part is adding a gain node, which is basically, think about it as the output for a Max patch, and that we're going to be sending it out to what we might think about as our DAC. And we are connecting our output that we just created to the context. So there's a spout for audio that the audio comes out of. This describes this web audio context and nodes are part of the signal chain that we're creating in the browser. Okay, moving forward, we have this patch export URL, which is storing our patch export.json, and we later on are going to be using that information to set up the rest of the audio context. If we had a Rainbow patch that used things like samples, then oftentimes we will have information that is stored within our export dependencies. You can see that if we click on dependencies.json, we have an empty array. And this is, if we had samples, then most likely this is where they would live, the names of those files, and then the audio files would live in this export area as well. But since we're not using samples, then this is empty. And the way that the app.js would understand it is, if we had any of these, then these dependencies, we can consider these to be samples in most cases, then it would say that we're going to be using the samples, let's get them ready so that we can recall and play them back in various ways later on. We're going to be creating what they call the device. So this device is a rainbow device, and you can see that there's a class heading of rainbow right here. And previously in this video, I said that there was a rainbow device that we're going to be getting some information from. When we load our page, our web page, this app.js is going to phone home to Rainbow servers in the cloud to get information based on what export version we have of our Rainbow patch, and then creating something that we call a Rainbow device. And that's going to be part of our audio context. And if it's not able to do that, then it will throw an error. But one thing that we need to note is when we run our web-based apps, it needs to be able to connect to another source in the internet to be able to actually run these apps. There are ways that we could possibly download the correct version of Rainbow so that we can create this app. Maybe in a later video we'll talk about that. We're going to name the Rainbow device lowercase d device, and you'll see this pop up later on in the page. If we had samples, then we would be loading those samples into a buffer that the device will be later be able to access. After we've created this Rainbow device, you'll notice that this code right here is really important, line 72, and we're saying that the device, we're going to connect the node from this device to our output node. Remember, that's the spout of audio that we have, our gain node. And you can see this language that is mentioned right here, the web audio graph. And when we hear audio graph, it's not like what we might have in elementary school for mathematics. We don't have an x and a y axes and we're plotting some sort of graph. It's not like that. It's more like graph theory where we have vertices and edges. Think about it as a signal chain where we have nodes. We have an output node where the audio comes out, and we just created another node higher in the chain where audio is going to be created or synthesized, and then we have it connected to another node, and then that's going to be put out from our speakers. The next section that we're going to be looking at here is one of the things I mentioned before. When we had this HTML page and we had these elements that I said had IDs, this next portion that we're going to highlight is where we can see that in action in the JavaScript. And we have this ID that I mentioned before, line 17 of the Index.html. We have a h1 tag with an ID of patcher title. In this app here, App.JS, line 75, you'll notice that there is a set of code that says document. This refers to the HTML page that we have this JavaScript running on. There's a command called getElementById, and it's looking specifically for a string called patcher.title. And it will rename the contents of that tag with the name of our patcher based on the file name that we had from our export. So if we go over to here, we see that there says unnamed patcher. Based on this code, it will pull information from our patcher, which is actually information from our export, our patch.export.json. And I think if we find the name of it, what is it looking for specifically? The file name. So if I go to my here and I go find, then I use Command F to use the find command in VS Code. You'll notice that there is a meta.file name called sequencer for rainbow.maxpat, and it's pulling that information from this heading and inserting it into the Index.html portion of the page. And so this line 75 basically says, look up into our export file, .json, and find that file name and replace the inner text of this tag. So take away that unnamed patcher and put in the name of that file name that we exported from Max. And you can see that if we open up Safari, then you can see sequencer for rainbow.maxpat is the same one over here. If I'm just going to test this. I don't know if this is going to work. I'm going to hit two exclamation marks. If we go back to Safari, load this page, you can see that that changes there because it's looking specifically from that area. I'm just going to remove that so that going back to app, and we're not going to talk too much about things, but there is some really nice code that they gave us for this template, and it will find whether or not we have sliders on our page or if it needs to make sliders. And then it looks up the different types of imports and outports. I'm going to load up Max real fast and pull up our rainbow patch real fast. Let's see, where are we at? Rainbow sequencer. I believe this is it. And diving into our rainbow, it will be able to find all the imports that we have created. There's import beats, import start transport, etc., etc. And be able to, based on the export.json, create these elements for us. Now, remember when we first started the series, we kind of over created imports and outports because we wanted to bring up the idea that we could be using imports and outports as well as params to access the contents of our patch. We're not going to use every single one of them because we over created them on purpose, because there's going to be more useful UI elements for web rather than using all of these, because we don't always want to use a slider to control the number of beats of our patcher, especially if we have floating point numbers. It would be really useful to use a slider for our volume, but it's going to be really, really, really unwieldy to do what we're doing right now, where we have to type in the values of our sliders, not our sliders, sorry, of our sequencer. If we go back to here, we have these multi-sliders, which is nice in Max, but you can see right now we haven't created this equivalent on the website. We're going to do something similar in the next video, but right now we don't want to use this text box, which is our main avenue of sending in basically the same sort of information. We are going to be using this sort of multi-slider vertically in the next video. But we're not going to use every single import and param, because even though we have some overlaps, so like we have beats here, it's going to be easier to do a slider here. So we're going to use some parameters and we're going to use some imports. But what's nice about this template, it shows us how it might create those things. So if I right click here on the make import form and I go to definition, it should take me to the function that's inside this setup function here. And you can see I'm going to close this Explorer tab. What it does is it looks up some more HTML elements and gives them some variable names, because we're going to be adding some parts to it. Quickly splitting this view, I can just drag this tab and bring it over to the right side, and I can see both the index and App.JS. And you can see on line 212 that it tries to find the rainbow-imports ID, and line 23 is where it is right now. And by default, it doesn't give us all of the fields that we see here, or this one field with all of these other options in this dropdown, right? And so it looks for these elements and then populates this input form here with the information pulled from the export.json. We're going to use some of this when we use our customized version, but looking through this is really useful. There's some catches, and says that, oh, if we don't have any imports, then it's going to not add any elements. But if we do have some imports, then it runs things called for each loops or for each functions. Basically, it's a non-iterated loop of elements. So if we have any number of imports, then it just runs through all of them that we have and then adds them or appends them as children to the import selection element. A couple other things that I think are important before we end this video is if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is in the description link. There's that Google Doc that I've been populating with interesting resources. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I've already received a number of emails, and hopefully I've been helpful for some people. Last thing that I really think is important is one thing to note in web development for audio, especially for web audio, is that if we're creating web audio elements, based on internet protocols, they cannot start on their own. And part of the code that we are going to be customizing later on is that we need to make sure that this context, which is shorthand for the audio context which we created at the very top of this document, has to be initiated or resumed based on user input. And so you might think about it as a mouse click or user touch on a mobile device, but this resume call needs to be called at some point when the user clicks on something or touches on the screen. Eventually someone comes across this issue and they thought that you can load up a page and the music will start blasting, but that's not the case. Internet Protocol doesn't allow us to do that for web audio. And so this type of code should exist somewhere. We're definitely going to do that in our customized code. Be aware that you might be scratching your head, why isn't it making sound? Because web audio must be initiated by user initiation. Cool. Next video, we're going to dive into our own version of this, and we're going to be looking at things like the style.css, and this basically controls how elements might look on our page. And so the color, the size, typeface, border, even positioning, we can rearrange things based on CSS. And we will not be using all of the imports like we see them here. We're going to use some sliders. We're going to have some elements that are going to be either a button press or multi-slider or slider. It's not going to be a one-to-one translation of what we might see for like a Max patch, where we can have multi-slider elements that look something like this with some other sliders. It's going to be a web version of this. We're not going to have some empty spaces, but we're going to talk about how we can use CSS to balance all these elements out. Cool. I hope you found this useful. We're not going to talk too much about the rest of what's inside this web app, because I'm going to pull the useful elements and then use them for ourselves. Thanks.